Why have we demonized oxalates for our children on the spectrum? Did you know that putting our children on an even more restrictive diet will actually lead to less chance of speech? Hi, my name is Natalie Pelto, and I am here to educate you on how to help your children get to independence without focusing on just restrictive diets, to help their brain develop and to support them in ways that is very much so needed. So number one, oxalates are not the demon, or they're not the devil. They are not something to necessarily be constantly avoided. And why is that? Well, I can tell you the story of one of our clients in the Blue Life Autism program. If you want to know more about that, there is a link below to join our next live event, which is a free webinar to explain that. Now, saying that, we'll name her Sally just to protect her confidentiality, and her son Kyle. So Sally and Kyle joined our program and were literally just eating a handful of foods. Why was that so hard? And why was this child not making gains? He came, he had pica, he was unable to even request his needs. He was completely non-speaking, but with a few words, good old ready, set, go, and no, and yes. And so we saw this beautiful child very stuck within his own world, almost in the confines of what felt like a fortress. And Kyle was not a picky eater. And so having a child that is very restricted in a time where the brain is developing is actually very detrimental to their growth in many different ways, from muscle tone to brain development to organ development, even just to basic ability to fine motor and gross motor functions. So that's the fancy way to say things are not building out because we're missing what we need. When we dove into a little bit more of a story or a little bit more of their history, they had been told to avoid oxalates as much as possible. What this led to was someone who was already doing a restrictive GAPS protocol, and then on top of it now had removed another layer of support that they could have been having. And the truth is that there are oxalates in every food, and yes, there are different levels, whether they're high or low. Spinach, for example, has high oxalates. Sweet potatoes have high oxalates as well. And then a lot of the root vegetables that we see have fall in the categories of low to high. Now, when you have a child who is on a restrictive diet like the GAPS diet, like Kyle was, he's already restricted as it is. This is a very strict version of paleo. So they're gluten, dairy-free, grain-free. They live basically on coconuts and almonds as the foundations for their flours, and these are high in oxalates. So we literally now have removed magnesium and zinc and many of the foods that are going to help our brain develop. So in Kyle's case, this was really harming his ability to communicate. And how was that happening? It means that some of the neuroreceptors, so basically the sites where we accept the messages, and then of course the neurotransmitters, where we are starting to use the messaging components of receptive and expressive language, these were not being built out, they were not being maintained, and he was really suffering. Now fast forward to about a year, and this is not even to talk about his poor microbiome that is being depleted. So many people now know about gut health, and gut health is linked to the good bugs that we have in our gut. Well, those good bugs, they actually eat different fibers. In just a second, I'm gonna give you 3 things as to why this is not the best approach, and then I'm gonna share a little bit about how to navigate understanding why focusing on diversity is going to help you overcome this. And this is very simple concept, and sometimes simplicity is where healing is found versus complicated testing and complicated supplementation protocols. So truthfully, when we saw Kyle and I saw how restricted he was, I said we need to slowly start to find his threshold. And Kyle had a handful of testing that I was happy to look at. When I saw it, there was obviously Candida that was present, and which is one of the things I will share is so many families spend thousands on tests like OAT test, which is an organic acid test, or a GI test, and we have this data. We don't need to be testing for Candida necessarily. I know that in some cases it is not present, but it is extremely rare. We know that 90%, as per studies conducted, that 90% of children on the spectrum do have an elevated amount of Candida albicans, which by default makes them a little more sensitive to oxalates. This has to do with the imbalance in the gut flora, which means pathogenic or opportunist bugs are taking over versus our white knights, our good bugs that are going to help us thrive. So having that knowledge now, one of the things that we want to be supporting, and the 3 tips that I will tell you in this area, is to number 1, focus on a rotation diet approach. It means that you don't need to focus just on oxalates. When you focus on rotating different foods and with a goal of about 35 to 50 plants per week, and this includes whole grains. Yes, I said the word grains. We do not do grain-free. These healthy whole grains are absolutely essential to the amino amino acids and the production of energy for our brain. That means our learning area, which our children who are nonverbal need. And we see children come in on restrictive diets and reintroduce very specific healthy whole grains, and their language just explodes. And the other thing that we want to focus on is just making sure that they're not getting the same foods every single day. This is where oxalates become an issue, is if we have rigidity. And rigidity means that we're always eating the same things over and over again. Now, our next thing that we want to look at as this tip number 2 is to focus on not just diversity and rotation. So first of all, I guess that was 2 and 1. But the next thing is to make sure that the amounts of foods that they are getting in the oxalate high family, which you don't even really have to watch, when you're giving and offering your child who is not a picky eater a diversity of food, you can make those portions a little bit smaller while you're including more variety. This means that by default, it is lowering the oxalate content, right? Just by making sure that, let's just say for breakfast, sweet potatoes, eggs, and some sort of almond bread, maybe the focus is on having 3 different vegetables in the place of sweet potatoes. So sweet potatoes, broccoli, and asparagus, or some other kind of vegetable. And then of course, having potentially maybe not an almond bread, but an oat bread or something that is a little bit less oxalate high than almonds, but not focusing on that piece. And then rotating these things and not having the same meal daily, having this meal maybe every 3rd day. That's one example of what a rotation diet would look like, and also what reducing, let's just say, the exposure to potentially high oxalate foods. When you're eating for diversity, which is tip number 2, and focusing on not smaller portions, but diversity of portions, you are by default going to mitigate that. Sorry, I'm gonna say one more thing for tip number 2, is that when you're focusing on diversity, this is a really important, so listen to this, is that the one thing that does actually change or mitigate oxalates in the body is calcium. And when you are eating for diversity, you will naturally be elevating how much calcium you're eating. And so you are going to mitigate oxalates in that area. And lastly, tip number 3, the focus is on making sure that for those specific oxalate high foods, maybe you cook them. For example, spinach can reduce up to 80% of its oxalate content by being steamed or by being sauteed. Same thing with when we're looking at, let's just say, almonds, when we're soaking them and then we're cooking them or we're turning it to powder. These things all lower the oxalate content. So I hope that that helps. All of this is to say that will be tips number 1, 2, and 3, is that if you are focusing on diversity and bringing in more foods, you're actually going to lower the chances of having high oxalate reactions. And I think that this is good for this video. I hope that you guys enjoyed it. If you did, stick around, because we're going to be diving into a whole series on how to decide and why diversity is going to help your child thrive versus restriction. Make sure to follow and subscribe below.